Shalom Aleichem, my dear brothers and sisters. In this video, I would like to describe to you the Jewish concept of Messiah, or at least according to my understanding, the Jewish concept of Messiah. So first, let me describe the word, the word Messiah. Like, what exactly does Messiah mean? Everybody uses that term, but what exactly does that mean? So in Hebrew, the term for Messiah is Moshiach, right? And this comes from the word limshoch. Now, what does that mean? That means Mashiach is someone upon whom the olive oil was poured. This is called Mashiach, and the verb of that word to pour olive oil upon someone is called limshoch. In one term, this can be translated as anointed with oil. And the reason for that is that the Messiah is called Mashiach, anointed, is because in the ancient days, if you read the books of Tanakh, you'll notice all throughout that when a person was promoted to a certain important position, he would be actually, upon him, someone would pour oil upon his head, and this was the ritual, the process of declaring that he is now appointed to this position. So, for example, this was done to the kings of Israel. When, for example, let's say the king chose one of his sons to be the next king, so they would anoint that person with oil, and he would be the anointed, right? The anointed one. And we see this when it comes to the priests, the descendants of Aaron, that served in the temple, right? So among the priests, there was always what's called a high priest, like the main priest. He's called Hakohen Hagadol, Kohen Hagadol, but sometimes he's called also Kohen Hamashiach, right? The anointed Kohen. And again, upon him, when he was appointed to the post of the high priest, someone would actually pour oil upon him. So this was the process. So therefore, this is where the word comes from. He's going to be anointed with oil. Now, what is exactly will the Messiah, the one we're waiting for, is going to be anointed for? Like what post? So the answer to that is that he's actually going to be anointed as the king of Israel. That's why he's called Mashiach, the anointed one. He's going to be anointed as the king. So therefore, I would say that the first characteristic or the Jewish concept of Messiah is that this individual, whoever is the Messiah, is supposed to be anointed as the king of Israel. Therefore, someone who claims to be the Messiah or who wants to be the Messiah, whatever, and he was never accepted as the king in Israel, cannot by definition be called a Mashiach, because he was never anointed as the king. So that's one of the characteristics. Another characteristic, important one, I would say, is that we see this in the book of Isaiah. We see this in chapter 11, verse 1, 2. Then we see this again in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 33, verse 15, that this Messiah that we're waiting for is going to be a descendant of David, peace be upon him. And the reason for that is because God promised to David that the kings will be his descendants. This was a reward to David, meaning the legitimate kings of Israel will be the descendants of David. And therefore, as Jews, when we appoint a king over ourselves, we are only allowed to appoint someone who is a descendant of David. In fact, by the way, just to mention that this was one of the mistakes of the Hashmoneans. If you remember, they were the defenders that fought against the Greeks, and even though they were righteous individuals and they were successful in war, defending the ancient Israel against the Greek empires, they made a mistake. They were the descendants of Aaron, they were the Kohanim, and the mistake was that they actually grabbed power afterwards and became kings. And this was something they were not supposed to do, at least according to the Rambam, I believe. They were supposed to anoint someone from the descendants of David to be the king of Israel. So another characteristic to paraphrase is that he is supposed to be a descendant of David, peace be upon him. Another characteristic. We see this in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 33, verse 18, and it describes that, well, before I go into this one, actually, let me maybe mention another one. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, verse 11 and 12, we see that another thing that the Messiah will do is that he will gather the rest of the Jews back to the land of Israel. And that's what it actually says in those verses, that he will gather the remaining of the Jews from other lands to the land of Israel. So that's another characteristic of Messiah, what he's going to do. Another characteristic of Messiah comes from the book of, I would say, Jeremiah, chapter 33, verse 18. And over there it describes how the Levites will, bring sacrifices and do services in the temple. Now, according to the Jewish law, and we see this from the Torah, that the Jews are only allowed to bring sacrifices, it says in the Torah, in the place that God will choose. Now, what place is this talking about, that God will choose? That's what the Torah says in the future tense. Now, we see later on in the books of Kings, when David and Solomon, peace be upon them, were kings, in those days, God actually did choose, eventually, the place. And what did he choose? He chose Jerusalem as the place of the main worship. And that was the place where the sacrifices were brought. And according to the Jewish law, this is the only place, as Jews, we are allowed to bring sacrifices to God. Interestingly to note, some of you may be curious, that for the non-Jews, according to the Torah, they are allowed to bring sacrifices to God in any place, even in their backyard, if they built, an altar and bring the proper sacrifice. But I would not recommend someone doing it unless he knows all the laws of ins and outs about how to do this. And I'm not even sure exactly if rabbis today know exactly how the non-Jews are supposed to be bringing sacrifices, but leave it as it may, as Jews, we are only allowed to bring sacrifices in the temple. And therefore, since in the book of Jeremiah it describes how the Levites are going to be bringing sacrifices and all that in the days of Mashiach, or after the days of Mashiach, one of the characteristics that Messiah is supposed to do is actually build the temple. This would be the third temple. The first one was built by Solomon and was destroyed. The second one was built by Ezra and Jews of his generation, and again was destroyed. So this would be the third temple. Now, how exactly will that temple look like? We have this in the book of Ezekiel, where he actually describes the dimensions and how the third temple will look like. So this is another characteristic of Messiah. Another characteristic of Messiah is that we see that he will be successful in wars. It says that eventually nations will attack the land of Israel, the Jews in the land of Israel, and the Messiah will be successful in waging wars against them, and eventually he will rule the whole world. We see this in the prophecies of Bilam, where he said a shoot from Jacob will emerge, and he will basically rule over the children of Shet. Shet was one of the sons of Adam, from whom all the humanity descended from. And I would say the most important characteristic of Messiah, according to the Jewish view, I would say is in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, verse 9. And over there we see that after Messianic age, the whole world will recognize the one and only true God and will worship this one God. The Lord of the God of Israel will become the Lord for the whole entire world. And this is, I would say, something the most important characteristic that one can say that Messiah will accomplish, or the action that Messiah will accomplish. Thank you so much for watching.